What's your most disturbing story? Crime scene cleanup crew members. Story 1. I live on a small island near Japan, so we have Japanese tourists visiting all the time. We have a popular beach that is listed as one of our top 3 tourist attractions. You had to climb down some stairs, as well as a ladder. Then you would have to jump down 5 feet onto the sand or water to reach the bottom, or you could jump off the cliff straight into the water. The jump from the main cliff was just 15 to 20 feet. The thing about this beach is that when it gets rough, the waves hit the cliff sides, and when they do, they reach astounding heights. The waves would get so big that they would reach the parking lot, which is about 35 feet away from the secondary cliffside. One summer, a Japanese man in his mid-20s, who seemed like an adrenaline junkie, went diving headfirst into the waves when they were still mild. It was still extremely dangerous, but mild compared to the waves that reach extreme heights. Well, the next day or so, word had spread that he had passed away. The locals said he was diving into the waves even after they advised him to stop. The man would jump into the waves from the cliff, climb the ladder and stairs back to the top, and jump right back in. The locals said they saw him jump repeatedly until he did not resurface. They called the police. The police arrived but could not do much for a while because the water was still very rough. The mist, salt in the air, and sand mixed within the waves made it hard to see. They had to wait a couple of hours for the water to calm. They searched for his body and eventually found him in the waters of a nearby beach. His body was severely damaged, with catastrophic injuries, and his legs were broken. They came to the conclusion that the waves had pushed him headfirst against the cliff with such force that the impact caused fatal internal trauma, and the rest of his injuries occurred because he continued to be slammed against the cliff sides for hours. There is a Japanese gravestone on the side of the beach that I always walk past, but I had not learned this story until I got older. I had always thought it was a small World War II monument or something. I guess not. Story 2. I am a police officer and have been on a good number of death scenes. One that sticks out in particular was a suspicious death on the top floor maintenance stairwell of a 5-story apartment building. I arrived and could smell the body from the bottom floor in the lobby. How it took this long for anyone to call in a building filled with 100 people is beyond me. I got in the elevator and began to go up, the smell getting worse with each floor. My corporal was with me and he started to look a bit sick. The door to the 5th floor opened and I was hit with a smell I will never forget. The poor man was lying face down on the top floor, landing just inside the doorway to the stairwell. He had been there for about 2 weeks in the middle of July in the southeastern United States. The top floor was not air-conditioned, as it was used for storage and maintenance, so it was around 100 degrees inside. The man was extremely bloated. Fluids were leaking everywhere, and his skin had turned a dark necrotic color. The fluids had leaked down the stairs, dripping onto the landings of the 4th and 3rd floors. This was classified as a suspicious death, so a detective had to come out to see if we could rule out homicide just to be sure. As my corporal was vomiting out of an open window, I had the unfortunate task of assisting the detective with rolling the body over to inspect it for wounds. I took hold of his arm and rolled him, and I felt the arm begin to separate from the body as more fluids spilled from his torso. Luckily, there were no obvious wounds. When the body removal team arrived, even they were gagging. Again, I assisted with moving the body onto the gurney. We put on full body protective suits and masks to move him in case the body ruptured. Fortunately, he only leaked and did not split apart. It turned out he had suffered a heart attack while on the landing, and nobody seemed to realize he was gone. Once he was identified, I realized I had met him the week before when he called in about a woman who overdosed on Hero that he came across while mowing yards for work, and she was given naloxone and survived. It is a small world. I also recently had a man who committed suicide by drinking polyurethane. And in case you are wondering, no, drinking polyurethane is not a painless or easy way to leave this world. Story 3. When I was in prison, we would take classes like human immunodeficiency virus and acquired immunodeficiency syndrome prevention, substance and alcohol substance abuse, and similar programs. There was one class where guest speakers, who were friends with the chaplain who ran the classes, would come in to share what were supposed to be life-changing experiences with the group. Or at least that was the idea. One morning, a man came in who looked like a pretty normal guy, and he told us as much himself. He said he had never been a substance addict, never had problems with alcohol, had a family, a good job, and volunteered as an emergency medical responder or something similar. Part of his role involved cleaning up after car crashes most of the time, not crime scenes, but still very intense situations. He went on to describe a routine call where he and another worker were cleaning up after a serious vehicle accident where someone had wrapped their truck around a tree. The speaker was cleaning blood from the passenger side floorboards when his hand slipped and he fell forward, landing face first in a pool of blood. He said he immediately knew it had gotten into his mouth and all over his face, and possibly into his eye as well, though I do not remember every detail clearly. What followed was the worst possible outcome. The driver involved had been positive for human immunodeficiency virus or some form of hepatitis, and the speaker later became infected. After that, his wife left him, told the children and extended family that their father was gay, and the family harassed him relentlessly, completely destroying his life. Everyone in that room, even in a prison setting, understood that things could always be worse by the time he finished telling his story. He stayed afterward to answer a few questions, though not many people spoke. Story 4. I am not part of a cleanup crew, but I have a story. A few years ago, I could not get in contact with my brother, so my stepmother and I drove out to make sure he was okay. He lived 2 hours away from me, and we had not heard from him in about 2 weeks, which was not completely unusual for him since he used a lot of substances and was a very solitary person. I ended up crawling through a window, and at first I did not smell anything extremely foul, just the musty scent of an old house. I managed to get the door open, and we found him in his room. He had clearly been deceased for several weeks. His body was badly bloated, and there was blood throughout the room. I did not initially notice insects, but according to the report, there were many present, and they were even mistaken for the bullet on the X-ray image of his head. We had to return to his house the next day, and I found one of his teeth on the closet door rail on the floor. Strangely, the house smelled much worse after his body had been removed. His hair was stuck to the carpet, and a few insects were still on the floor. To discourage anyone from self-harm, it was determined that he had shot himself in the head and survived long enough to place the gun under his mattress before lying down and waiting to die, which caused blood to soak into the mattress. The bullet was a .22 caliber as far as I was told. It seems he realized what he had done was a mistake, tried to get up to reach his phone, and collapsed in the spot where we eventually found him. Story 5. On my first day, I was supposed to clean fake vomit out of a police car, but instead we got a SUIC call. It was at a Motel 6, where a 20-year-old man had checked into a room and shot himself in the chest. Somehow his father knew where he was staying and managed to get a key to the room. When he opened the door, he smelled gunpowder and immediately called the police because he knew what had happened. Another SUIC scene I worked on stood out because, first, it involved a woman, since the vast majority of SUIC calls were men, and second, she used a firearm. I was told this was extremely rare, as women tend to use other methods. Some of my co-workers who had been in the field for 10 years or more said they had never encountered a female SUIC involving a gun before. She lived in a nice townhouse in a good area and was divorced, living alone after her children had grown up. Her home was very clean except for the blood. For reasons I never fully understood, her ex-husband was visiting, and while they were talking in the living room, she pulled out a pistol and shot herself in the chest. It was unsettling cleaning blood from around her decorations, especially with signs around the house displaying cheerful messages like, "Love grows in this garden," or "Live, laugh, love." I also cleaned what had once been a beautiful 3-story home belonging to a successful surgeon. She had devoted her life to her work, but after an injury she was forced to retire early. With no family, she became depressed and began collecting cats. By the time we were called, the cats had completely overtaken the house, and she was living in a small room in the basement. Animal control reported removing about 60 living cats, and we found many deceased animals, including mummified remains and multiple litters of kitten skeletons. The smell of ammonia was overwhelming, making the air feel thick, and every surface was covered in layers of matted hair and waste. Even the walls were stained, and metal objects throughout the house were corroded from the exposure. Another job involved a home in a very affluent area belonging to a family with young children. The father had been cleaning out a tool shed and began feeling ill a few days later. The family had a trip planned, and he insisted his wife and children go without him while he planned to follow later. By the time they landed, he was hospitalized, and shortly after they returned home, he had died. It took about a week for health officials to determine it was hantavirus, likely contracted from rodent droppings in the shed. The family had to abandon their large, beautiful home and nearly everything inside due to possible contamination. The eerie part was how orderly everything looked. Aside from a rotting bowl of fruit, dried out plants, and books about grief scattered around, including one children's book titled, "Someone I Know Died." What ultimately broke me was a job that required crawling through sewage beneath local housing projects, which made me realize I could no longer do this work. Story 6. Up until recently, I used to run a small crime scene cleaning business that I operated for a couple of years. We handled a number of strange, sick, and disturbing jobs. But one that has always stuck in my mind took place at a local hotel a few years ago. I received the call-out request early on a Sunday morning from the night duty manager who requested our services, and it is important to note that we had experienced heavy monsoonal rain the night before. I packed my utility vehicle and made my way to the location. When I arrived, I was met by the duty manager and several of his visibly shaken staff members, who led me to the second floor of the hotel, which was under construction at the time. They guided me to an outdoor dining area that overlooked the pool on the ground floor, and I was immediately struck by the smell of fresh blood. Decomposition has a distinct odor that you eventually grow accustomed to, but fresh blood creates a deeply unsettling, almost primal sense of danger that is difficult to describe. In what had once been an outdoor garden area, there was now a large pool formed by the monsoonal rain, mixed with the blood of a man who had fallen from the roof and struck a slatted grate above the garden below. My task was to use the existing drainage to remove approximately 2,000 liters of contaminated water, clean the slatted structure above the outdoor garden on the third floor, and then remove all of the fingerprint powder that local police had heavily applied throughout the hotel room. All of this had to be done discreetly, as this was a 4-star hotel, and holiday guests below were happily going about their day, completely unaware of what had occurred the night before. After finishing the work, I spoke with the now off-duty manager, who explained what had happened. He said the man who ended up by the pool had been on an extended drinking spree with a friend. Security footage showed the two of them running around the hotel in the early hours of the morning, wearing only boxer shorts and appearing visibly intoxicated and disorderly. According to the statement given to police, they had also taken lysergic acid diethylamide, and while they were fooling around in the hotel room, taking pictures and encouraging each other to do reckless things, the man somehow went over the balcony. It was a real tragedy, as he was only in his early 20s, and what was meant to be a fun night ended in a fatal accident. I have many more stories from that line of work, which I took great pride in, and it offered a unique perspective on life and death that most people never get to see. Story 7, I worked as a call center claims representative a few years ago, and this story stayed with me so deeply that I had to take the rest of the day off after the call. I received a call from the grandson of an elderly bedridden woman. He was the only person who regularly checked in on her, but he lived quite far away, so his visits were sometimes spaced weeks apart. On the day in question, he arrived at her home and opened the door, only to be overwhelmed by a horrific stench that immediately made him gag. What he saw next caused him to vomit uncontrollably, and he ran outside and called the police. The woman had suffered a brain aneurysm while lying in bed. She was too sick and weak to move or call for help, and it had been 3 weeks since the grandson's last visit. Blood was everywhere. The body had begun to decompose, and insects were present throughout the room. The entire space was stained with blood, as if an explosion had occurred. It was later explained that she died when blood pooled into a vessel in her brain, and due to her age and the elasticity of her skin, the blood accumulated into what was described as a bubble before rupturing violently and dispersing throughout the room. The grandson was calling to file a claim on her property insurance policy to be reimbursed for the hazardous cleanup costs, which totaled around $10,000. I listened to his account in silence, horrified, mechanically typing out the claim while struggling to process what I was hearing. All I could manage to say was that I was sorry and that an adjuster would contact him within 1 business day with the next steps. After the call ended, I informed my supervisor about what I had just handled, and told them I was taking the rest of the day off and would return the following day. Story 8. I am not a crime scene technician, but I took a class to qualify for entry-level jobs in that field. Our instructor was a detective from a major metropolitan city near us. He told us a story about responding to a crime scene where the body was located in an attic and had been there for quite some time, reaching the late stages of decomposition. He explained how the body bloats from the buildup of gases, bile, and fluids, and how the skin becomes thin and oily during the process. It was not a pleasant sight or smell, though I never experienced it firsthand. He showed us photographs in class, not from that exact case, but from bodies in a similar stage of decomposition. When the coroner's team arrived, dressed in protective coveralls and masks, they wrapped the body in plastic and placed it on a stretcher, but they had to maneuver it down a narrow and steep attic entrance. Our instructor, the detective, was standing at the bottom supervising since it was an active crime scene. One of the coroner's assistants managed to get partway down, clearly struggling to guide the body through the opening, when the worst possible thing happened. The body ruptured inside the bag like a water balloon. The bags were not fully sealed, so fluids began leaking out and poured onto the unfortunate assistant standing at the bottom of the attic stairs. He was covered in blood, bile, and other bodily fluids. Our instructor swore that he watched the man begin vomiting inside his mask, which quickly filled with vomit. I do not know for certain if every detail was true, but based on the images he showed us that day, it was clear that detectives are exposed to things most people never have to see. Story 9. I was not part of a cleanup crew, but I did an internship in a coroner's office for one summer. My duties included assisting with autopsies, cleaning the office, disposing of old organ storage bags, which are required to be kept for 5 years unless the case involved homicide, sudden infant death syndrome, or an unknown cause, performing data entry, and handling various other tasks. 2 experiences from that time have always stayed with me. On my first day, I assisted with the autopsy of a homeless man who had been living in a storage unit. It was summertime, and he had been using buckets inside the unit for basic needs. He died there and was not discovered for about a month. When we brought him into the autopsy room, the odor was overwhelming even through the body bag, and I was already gagging before anything began. One of the technicians placed a sheet on the floor before rolling the cart over it, which confused me until the bag was opened. Instead of seeing a body, I saw hundreds of insects covering what remained, and they immediately began falling off the cart. I was told it was my job to crush them as they fell, so they would not spread throughout the building. I found myself stomping around a partially liquefied skeleton, holding my nose and trying not to vomit. The other story involved the basement storage area, where organ bags and evidence from old cases were kept, including weapons. For reasons I never fully understood, there were also several jars containing infant remains. During my first week, I noticed an unusual item sealed in a bag with a case number written on it, which made me curious how it had been involved in a death. Since I had access to the case files for data entry, I eventually looked it up and learned that an older man had suffered a fatal heart attack during a private moment, and the autopsy concluded the death was due to cardiac failure rather than injury. I remember thinking that there were certainly worse ways to go. Story 10. The call came in around 3 in the afternoon, just as my coworker and I finally sat down to eat lunch. We had just finished dealing with a gastrointestinal bleed that thankfully was not fatal. The man on the phone sounded distant and cold, almost robotic as he answered the standard questions, and it quickly became clear that we needed to respond immediately, meaning lunch was no longer happening that day. The house was a typical suburban home in an upscale neighborhood, and we met the homeowner sitting on the driveway near the road. He told us the incident had taken place in the back bedroom and the hallway, instructed us to let ourselves in, do what needed to be done, and said he would handle everything else once the cleanup was complete. As we entered with our camera, the house appeared immaculate, with family photographs on the walls and baseball trophies displayed near a decorative fireplace. The first thing that caught my attention was a leash hanging by the door, followed by food and water bowls near the refrigerator, and it struck me that I neither saw nor heard a dog. As we approached the scene, the blood spatter was visible even before entering the hallway. His teenage son had argued with his stepmother, and in a moment of rage, took his father's shotgun loaded with birdshot and fired into her chest in the hallway. He then walked to the bedroom and shot his best friend, a German Shepherd, before turning the gun on himself. I see death often, and I see a lot of blood, but the outline where the dog had fallen is something that still brings me to tears. Story 11, I owned an auto repair shop located between two tow companies that both held contracts for evidence storage. Whenever a car, truck, or motorcycle was involved in a fatal incident, they were required to hold the vehicle. This was in the San Francisco Bay Area, so these situations happened fairly often. One time, a brand new Camaro Supersport came in, purchased only about 5 or 6 years ago at the time, and the driver's side window had been shot out. Someone had approached the vehicle and shot both the driver and the passenger, and both of them died. The car had been purchased only a week earlier. Normally, a dealership can retrieve a vehicle from impound even if the driver lost it for 30 days. But in this case, the police refused to release it. The car sat in the tow yard as evidence for 8 months, and the tow company charged the city $75 per day for storage. Eventually, the police cleared it for release. The tow company filed a lien, and in some cases, the finance companies missed these filings, which happened here. As a result, the tow company took legal ownership of the car. They installed new seats, replaced the damaged door panel, repaired the window, and thoroughly detailed the vehicle. They sold it and made a significant profit from both the sale and the accumulated storage fees. Despite the restoration, the interior had originally been a horrific sight, with blood and debris throughout the vehicle. Story 12. I am not part of a cleanup crew, but I do have a very grim story. A couple of years ago, my father, his friend, and his friend's son went to a bar together. They stayed out until around midnight before deciding to go home, and all three of them were extremely intoxicated. My father's friend's son, who I will call John, went back to his cottage. John was only about 19 years old. He went inside, turned on the electric fireplace in the living room, and instead of going to bed, he lay down on the rug in front of it. He was still heavily intoxicated and must have lost consciousness while lying on his back. At some point during the night, he vomited and did not wake up, and his airway became blocked, causing him to suffocate. He was not discovered until 3 days later when his father found him. The only description I was ever given was that it did not look real, and I try not to imagine what it looked like. This is not exactly a cleanup story, but more a story of heartbreak. I cannot imagine being a father and walking in to find your own son's body after 19 years of caring for him and seeing him like that. I know it gets said often, but please drink responsibly, not just for yourself, but for the people who love you. Story 13. I was a highway patrol officer in my younger years, working between Sacramento and Tahoe along the Interstate 50 corridor. And while I saw plenty of horrific scenes, one particular incident has never left my mind. I was driving behind a 1970s Cadillac that began drifting into oncoming traffic, and I could see the driver violently assaulting a woman in the passenger seat. I activated my lights and ordered the vehicle to pull over, and as it slowed, the rear passenger door suddenly opened and a woman tumbled out onto the roadway. I narrowly avoided hitting her, but the car behind me, a Datsun 240Z, struck her body, lifting its front wheels off the ground and slamming into the guardrail, completely crushing the front end. The Cadillac pulled over in front of me, and the driver was screaming that his sister-in-law was dead, while the woman with him was badly beaten and crying that her sister had been killed. I ran to the 240Z and found a woman and a teenage boy trapped inside. The boy unconscious, both pinned in the wreckage while fuel poured across the asphalt and began smoking. A fire erupted under the hood, and I grabbed my fire extinguishers, called for emergency fire services, and discharged everything I had. But the flames continued. The woman inside was panicking, begging me to get her out, and I did everything I could. Other drivers stopped and brought their own extinguishers, but the fire would not go out, and the fire truck was still 30 minutes away. We needed hydraulic rescue tools, but none were available. The flames began spreading into the interior, burning her legs, and she screamed uncontrollably. Her hair caught fire, and several of us desperately pulled on the door, knowing it was hopeless but trying anyway, because she still had hope. The heat became unbearable, and we were forced to back away. I will never forget the look in her eyes as she realized she was going to die in the fire. I wanted to end her suffering, but there was no possible way a law enforcement officer could do that on the side of the road in front of dozens of people. including children. Others begged to intervene violently, and I had to stop them. She screamed for what felt like 10 minutes, though it was only about 5. The fire truck arrived 15 minutes later, but it was far too late. That was the worst scene I ever witnessed. The driver of the Cadillac was later convicted of manslaughter and domestic violence. Story 14. I do not work in cleanup, but I do work in crime scene investigation, and my worst case involved a drunk driving incident. A man was driving a sports car while heavily intoxicated at extremely high speed through an urban area at around 4 in the morning. He lost control of the vehicle and crashed directly into a thick concrete power pole, with the car becoming lodged almost halfway through the structure. The entire engine was embedded into the electrical system of the pole, which ignited the vehicle. The man was trapped inside, pinned by the steering wheel, and the entire car caught fire. Firefighters responded, but because it was an electrical fire, it took longer than usual to extinguish the flames. While we were conducting the crime scene investigation after the fire was put out, the vehicle reignited and firefighters had to be called back again. The car was then loaded onto a flatbed tow truck for transport to the medical examiner's office. But during morning traffic around 8 o'clock, it caught fire yet again while on the truck, requiring another emergency response to finally put it out completely. Once the vehicle arrived at the medical examiner's facility, it had to be forcibly cut open just to remove the body. The remains were severely burned, and the heat had fused skin and bone to the car seat and surrounding metal. The medical examiner was forced to separate parts of the remains from the vehicle because they were too integrated with the structure of the car to remove intact. Story 15. I used to transport bodies for a large funeral home in a crime-heavy state in the southwestern United States, and I worked the night shift, which meant being on call from 5 in the evening until 8 in the morning, a time when everything somehow feels worse. One night around 2 in the morning, I received a call from our answering service saying we had a body to retrieve from a local military base, which was highly unusual since we almost never received calls directly from the base. I called the provided contact to confirm arrival time, and the man identified himself as a chaplain and insisted we arrive as soon as possible and bring state-issued identification and passports if available. When my associate and I arrived in our company transport van, dressed in black suits and dress shoes because the funeral home prioritized appearance over practicality, we were stopped at the gate by heavily armed military personnel with dogs. We were removed from the vehicle, our identification was taken. The dogs searched the van, and we were questioned extensively because our presence and attire clearly raised suspicion. Eventually, we were escorted to base housing, not a facility, where the area was crowded with personnel wearing protective suits and the atmosphere was tense. As we entered the house, several armed men aimed their weapons at us until the chaplain rushed down the stairs shouting that we were the body transport team and to stand down. We were led upstairs to a master bedroom that looked chaotic, with furniture displaced, medical waste scattered, and a large man lying on the floor with medical equipment still attached. The chaplain explained the process to us and instructed us to retrieve the stretcher. But once we did, we realized it could not navigate the extremely steep, carpeted staircase with a sharp turn. We were told we would have to carry the body down manually. I am a small woman, and my associate was not much larger, but with the chaplain present, we wrapped the body and attempted to move him. It was then revealed that the man had died by hanging, was not yet stiff, and was extremely heavy and difficult to maneuver. We requested assistance, and a military member joined us. As we descended the stairs head first, I suddenly felt warm liquid soaking my neck, back, and chest, and moments later my associate slipped on the blood-soaked, carpeted stairs, nearly causing us to lose control of the body. The military assistant managed to stabilize the situation, and we were eventually able to get the body onto the stretcher without further incident. Only then did I fully realize that blood had covered my entire upper body. Despite the tragedy of the death itself, nothing compared to the experience of being exposed to that much blood and then having to request medical evaluation to ensure I had not been exposed to a serious bloodborne illness. Story 16. My mother rents out a guest house on her property, and just last week her tenant accidentally overdosed on coca, or at least that is what it appears to be, although the coroner has not confirmed it yet. He likely died sometime on Saturday night and was not discovered until Wednesday. The air conditioning was running, but we live in Florida. His cat stayed on the bed with him the entire time. No, the cat did not harm him, but it was clearly traumatized. I asked the police if we could take the cat temporarily, and they allowed it, so I brought the cat to our place and gave it a bath. After that, they removed the body. My mother and I then went into the guest house to remove the mattress and take it to the trash. But as soon as I entered the room, I told my mother to go back to her house and not look inside. Blood had soaked completely through the mattress pad, and the police had left blood and other fluid-soaked sheets and blankets piled in two corners of the room, along with their gloves. I am sure this was not the worst scene imaginable, but it was the worst and only death scene I have ever had to clean up. As a strange side note, I was pulled over for speeding on my way to my mother's house and told the officer there was a dead body in my mother's house. His response was that he was only there because I was speeding. I did not think about it at the time, but in hindsight, it seems like he maybe should have asked a few more questions. Story 17. Years ago, this was the business I worked in, and I cleaned up everything from suics to murder scenes. One thing many people do not realize about this line of work is that I never actually saw the bodies themselves, only what remained after the coroner had finished. The most disturbing part was often not the physical scene, but the story behind it, as if you were stepping into a frozen moment in time. The worst jobs to clean were overdoses because the bodies were usually not found for many weeks, leaving extensive decomposition behind. When I say something smells like death, I truly know what that means. One of the most shocking scenes was cleaning up a grocery store after a disgruntled former employee ran through the store with a samurai sword, killing 2 people and injuring 5 others before being shot and killed by police. The saddest scene in terms of circumstance was cleaning a car after a teenager was shot at close range for stealing a pumpkin from someone's front porch. The most disturbing job of all was cleaning a wood chipper and truck after a landscaping employee was pulled through it. In that case, there was no intact body for the coroner to collect. Story 18. This did not happen to me, but a close friend of mine who works in law enforcement told me about a call that still haunts him to this day. He was dispatched to an apartment building for a missing person report and arrived to find the family of a woman in her early 20s waiting outside her apartment. They had not heard from her in several days, which was unusual because she normally responded quickly to calls and messages. They had even gone to her workplace and were told she had not shown up for several days. Since they did not have keys, he and his partner went up to the roof, accessed the fire escape, and climbed down to her floor. The lights were on inside the apartment, but there was no sign of anyone. They located the building's superintendent, who rushed over to unlock the door. Because they did not know what they might find, the family was asked to wait in the lobby while the superintendent stayed in the hallway. Inside the small one-bedroom apartment, they searched every room and initially found nothing. In the bedroom, there was a large bed with a comforter hanging over the sides, and my friend's partner noticed a big toe sticking out from underneath. Thinking she might be hiding, my friend knelt down and lifted the comforter to look under the bed, only to find the missing woman deceased, discolored, and contorted with an expression of terror that he later compared to something out of a horror film. She had been dead for at least 3 days. According to her family, she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia in recent years, but it was believed to be under control, and it is thought she suffered a psychotic episode, crawled under the bed, became trapped, and died there. He told me that even now he sometimes dreams about her distorted face, and I cannot imagine having to live with that image. Story 19. I did crime scene cleaning for a few months, so I have a few stories, but the one that sticks with me the most is this one. We got a call for a job one day, hopped in the van, and headed out to the location. When we arrived, it was a pretty nice house with a large yard and backyard. We got out of the van and walked up to a man who was waiting for us outside in front of the house. He brought us around to the back and began explaining what had happened. His longtime friend of more than 40 years had come over the night before using a spare key he had, since he used to watch the house and the client's dogs when the homeowner was away. The friend went into the kitchen, grabbed a large kitchen knife, walked out to the middle of the swimming pool, cut his own throat, and bled out in the pool. No one realized anything was wrong until the homeowner's wife went looking for the friend and asked if he had seen or heard from her husband. Because they were worried he had not come home and he had a young child, around 5 years old. That was when the discovery was made. It was heartbreaking for several reasons, not only because the man lost his best friend of decades, but also because his entire pool and deck had to be demolished. When the body was removed, biological material was spread throughout the pool area and permanently stained the deck. The homeowner was clearly devastated by everything that had happened, and we did not push him for details, as it would have been completely inappropriate. Story 20. We received a call for a SUIC at an apartment complex and responded immediately. Emergency medical personnel had already removed the body, so our task was strictly the cleanup. The man was a double amputee who lived off the settlement from a court case after a car accident had taken both of his legs. He lived a very isolated life, with his only regular interaction being his physical therapist, who spent several hours a day with him during the week. When he decided to end his life, he did so in his motorized wheelchair in the bathroom. There was a small shower bench with a towel on it, neatly arranged with a book, 2 steak knives, an unlit cigarette, and a vaping device. One of the knives was covered in blood. He had stabbed himself in the stump of one leg and bled out onto the floor. The apartment complex wanted the cheapest possible cleanup, so they signed the authorization and liability release and instructed us to do the bare minimum and finish as quickly as possible. They specifically told us no warning signs, no containment outside the unit, and no protective suits in shared areas. We began by laying plastic from the front door to the bathroom and moving the personal items onto plastic in another room. After suiting up, we started removing the coagulated blood from the floor in order to pull up the vinyl, since blood had seeped underneath and it could not be saved. I was on my knees scooping up thick, jelly-like blood when my coworker nudged my shoulder and motioned toward the front door. I stood up and looked, and the physical therapist had just walked in. She learned that the man she had been working with for over a year had died by seeing me with my arms covered up to my elbows in his blood. She broke down immediately, saying she had tried to warn people that something was wrong and that no one listened, and talking about how close she had grown to him over the past year. Story 21. I used to live in Chicago, and I had a neighbor who was an older man, probably in his 60s. We were not particularly close, but we would say hello and chat whenever we ran into each other outside. One spring, I was outside preparing the small yard I had for a summer garden when he walked by, and we talked for a few minutes before he went back inside his house. Life went on. I planted my garden, harvested vegetables, and by autumn I started planning for the following year. I decided I wanted to expand the garden and thought I might ask my neighbor if I could use his backyard, which had always been completely overgrown and unused. I figured I could clean it up and we would both benefit. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer, even though I could hear the television on. I assumed he had fallen asleep, so I left a note with my phone number taped to the door. At the time, I did not think much of it. The last time I had seen or spoken to him had been sometime in April or May, and this was already October or November. A few days or perhaps a week later, I received a voicemail from a Chicago police officer asking me to call back regarding my neighbor. When I did, I learned that my neighbor had been found dead in his home, and the officer asked when I had last seen him. I told him it must have been a couple of weeks before Mother's Day, around the time I usually prepare to plant my garden. In the weeks that followed, the neighbor's family came to clean out and renovate the house for sale or rental, and I spoke with them briefly. They told me I was likely the last person to have seen him alive. He had been found face down in his living room and appeared to have died from a heart attack. The disturbing part was that when they removed his body, the skin and tissue from the front of his body had adhered to the floor and separated during removal. What still unsettles me most is that throughout the summer, while I worked in my garden, I would occasionally catch faint smells of decay when the wind blew, but I dismissed it as garbage from the alley because it was inconsistent and not very strong. Story 22. I am a student nurse, and this is not a crime scene story, but based on other stories, I will share it since it has turned into people talking about extreme medical trauma. I was in the emergency department of a major hospital in my area and was talking with the nurses before the shift started. One of them was especially kind, and after chatting for a while, I asked out of curiosity what the most disturbing thing she had ever witnessed as an emergency department nurse was. She told me it happened around midnight on a rainy night when the department was unusually quiet and nothing was coming in. They then received a call that paramedics were transporting a patient involved in a motorcycle accident. The patient had reportedly hit a curb, been thrown from the motorcycle, and struck a street sign. He was classified as a trauma 1, the highest level of emergency priority. The paramedics arrived with the patient lying flat on a stretcher, his midsection covered with a sheet. He was conscious, alert, and talking, and he did not appear to be in pain. He was wheeled into the trauma bay, a room with a metal table and multiple machines used for resuscitation, and the medical team gathered to begin treatment. When they removed the sheet covering his abdomen, they saw something she said she would never forget. The patient had been traveling at nearly 110 miles per hour when he was thrown into the sign, and the pole had impacted directly at his navel. The force of the impact had separated the upper internal organs from the lower ones and had compressed the major blood vessels in such a way that he did not immediately bleed out. His spine was essentially the only structure maintaining alignment. He survived for about 30 minutes after arriving at the hospital. Staff were able to contact his mother, who came to be with him in his final moments. Before she arrived, they carefully covered his body with blankets and instructed her not to look underneath. Hearing that story was enough to convince me that I will never ride a motorcycle. Story 23, I worked as a tow truck driver while I was in college, and one night we responded to a crash involving a coal-hauling semi-truck that rolled over on a blind curve and struck a Ford Ranger in a remote area. My partner and I arrived several hours after the accident, once the fire department and paramedics had already left. We assessed the scene and began setting up to flip the semi back upright. While preparing, my partner picked up a side mirror and casually remarked that he thought the Ranger had been purple, which seemed odd, but we did not dwell on it. Setting up took about an hour, and when we attempted the first lift, it failed, and the semi slammed back down, sending coal dust everywhere just as the sun set. On the second attempt, we successfully flipped the semi. As we started working on the air brake lines, the area went eerily quiet, and then we heard muffled screaming. After searching for several minutes, we realized the sound was coming from a second vehicle that had tried to avoid the initial crash, gone into a ditch, been buried under roughly 3 feet of coal, and then had the semi slide over it. At the scene were only my partner, myself, the property owner, and a highway patrol officer. The property owner ran to get his backhoe to help dig, while the officer stood by and radioed the situation in. That left my partner and me digging by hand. After clearing the roof, a hand suddenly appeared, waving frantically from the driver's side. We reassured her and continued digging until the backhoe arrived and cleared the rest. About 30 minutes later, rescue crews returned with hydraulic tools and cut the roof off. The young girl inside had broken nearly every bone in her body. It became even more tragic when we learned she was underage and learning to drive, and her mother, who had been in the passenger seat, had been killed on impact. The girl had been trapped next to her deceased mother for approximately 6 hours and survived having the semi dropped on the car twice. Months later, she came by the station to thank us, her body still covered in external traction braces. I thanked her and left quickly before I became physically ill from the memory. Story 24. A truck driver parked at a large local truck stop died in his sleep. It is not uncommon for local drivers to leave their rigs parked there for several days at a time. Because it was summertime, the truck stop was full of trucks coming in from stockyards, and since it was near the interstate, nobody noticed the smell for more than a week. By the time he was found, the man's body had begun to break down severely. He was bloated, and most of the bodily fluids had settled toward the bottom of the sleeper. The only way we could figure out how to remove him was through the small side window that serves as an emergency exit. While trying to maneuver the body into a bag, one of the technicians pulled on the arm, which nearly detached and released far more fluid than anyone expected. The bed and floor were completely saturated with the odor. Once the body was finally secured, it felt less like a person and more like a bag of gelatin. The truck itself had to be moved, and we assumed a tow truck would handle it. Instead, somehow, the towing company employee rolled the windows down, started the engine, and with a police escort drove the truck roughly 12 miles to a cleanup site. Something I still do not understand how he managed to do. Story 25. I was not part of a cleanup crew, but when I worked at a coffee shop, a woman overdosed and died in the lobby while I was the only employee on the floor. 4 unsettling-looking middle-aged women came into the store, all with different colored hair and shaved patches on their heads, appearing far older than they likely were. About 10 minutes after they entered, 3 of them suddenly ran out, knocking over chairs and tables as they fled. Because of the layout of the store, I could not see the 4th woman, but I knew she was still inside. Customers briefly craned their necks to see what happened, and then went back to their drinks and conversations. I continued taking orders and making drinks because there was still a line. When I finished with the last customer, I walked into the lobby and found the 4th woman slumped over, with white foam running down her arm and pooled on the floor. When I touched her, she already felt cold, and it had been about 10 minutes since the others had run out. Paramedics were called, but it was far too late. What disturbed me most was that customers had been sitting right next to her and must have watched her die, yet they refused to acknowledge her presence even after emergency personnel arrived. Story 26. I was not part of a cleanup crew, but I had to help clean my in-laws' home after my father-in-law passed away. To say he was depressed would be an understatement. The air inside the house was thick with stale cigarette smoke, and during the final year of his life, he lived in extreme neglect. There were makeshift containers filled with urine, including a 4-cup measuring cup, animal waste on the floors, piles of clothes, trash, and unidentified substances covering nearly every surface. My wife warned me it was bad, but her description did not come close to preparing me for the reality. The smell alone was overwhelming, and I had to wear a full protective outfit with gloves, a respirator mask, safety goggles, and clothing that I planned to throw away afterward. While the house itself was unbearable, the basement was far worse. What neither of us realized was that her parents had kept an old ice chest whose motor had failed years earlier. Inside were bags containing fishing supplies and leftover catches that had been forgotten for nearly a decade. When I opened it, the odor was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a suffocating mix of decay, sulfur, and rot that cut straight through my mask and made me gag instantly. I resealed it as fast as I could and began desperately searching for a professional cleanup company that could both remove the contents and neutralize the smell. After days of calls and emails, I finally found a national restoration company that specialized in extreme cleanup situations. Even they told me it required their strongest chemicals and rated the smell at the highest level they had encountered. I burned the clothes and shoes I wore that day, and it took weeks for the sensation of the smell to leave my nose, with random triggers bringing it back. Eventually, the property was sold and the house demolished because it was no longer livable after the way my father-in-law had deteriorated following his wife's death. Story 27. This is probably too late for anyone to see, but I worked security for a company that owned a lot of property along the central coastal area of California. One of the properties was an old rundown motel near the beach that was mostly used by people staying for months at a time, with no air conditioning, no pool, and very few amenities. One day I got a call from the front desk saying guests were complaining about a smell coming from one of the rooms. The woman renting it was extremely overweight, not very clean, and had been openly hostile towards staff in the past, so no one wanted to deal with her, and it fell on me. It was a brutally hot day with no breeze at all, and the smell reached all the way to the street, about 40 yards away. When I opened the door, it was almost impossible to breathe. She had died sometime earlier that week, though I do not know exactly when. She was lying on her back on the bed and was so large that she filled the entire mattress. The front of her body had turned pale while the back was extremely dark from prolonged heat and pressure. When emergency responders arrived, they attempted to move her from the bed to the gurney using the sheet beneath her. During the lift, one person lost their grip and she fell. Her body ruptured on impact, releasing an overwhelming amount of fluid and making the odor instantly far worse. Everyone present began retching, and the situation deteriorated quickly. In the end, responders had to use tools to gather what they could and complete the removal. Story 28. 2 incidents really stand out to me. In the first, I was driving home from work and was close to my apartment when police blocked the road because of an accident. After showing proof that I lived there, they let me through, but my apartment faced the scene. A woman riding a scooter was struck and crushed between a truck and a car at the bottom of a steep hill near a red light. There was no speeding involved, just terrible timing and terrain. The impact caused catastrophic injuries, and parts of her body were trapped between the vehicles. Emergency crews covered what they could as quickly as possible. The scene was fresh, and the driver of the car remained nearby in visible shock. My roommate and I stood with other residents watching in silence as responders pried the vehicles apart and collected what remained. Fire and rescue washed the roadway afterward, and because it was the rainy season in Florida, the evidence disappeared quickly. The second incident involved an elderly couple who were struck while driving to church by a man traveling at extreme speed in a residential zone. Both vehicles were completely destroyed. I happened to walk by before medical responders arrived and could see that both occupants were deceased from the severity of the impact. The driver who hit them survived with injuries and was sitting on the roadside. That one stayed with me because the couple died instantly while the person responsible lived and was later jailed. Story 29. I am not a crime scene cleaner, but I once had to clean a room soaked in blood. My brother attempted to end his life by getting heavily intoxicated and cutting his arms and his upper leg with a razor blade. The cuts on his wrists were shallow, but he severely injured a major artery in his leg and was bleeding uncontrollably. There was so much blood on the floor that I was slipping while trying to help him. I happened to be wearing a paracord bracelet that could be unraveled into rope, so I removed it, wrapped it tightly around his upper thigh, and used a pen as a windlass to twist it into a makeshift tourniquet until emergency services arrived. It slowed the bleeding enough to save his life. After he was taken away, I had to clean the room myself. It took hours to remove the blood, scrubbing dried stains from the floor and surfaces. By the end, my hands were stained red, my clothes were soaked and had to be thrown away, and it took more than an hour in the shower to clean myself completely. The smell of that room is something I will never forget, and it was one of the few times in my life that the sight and reality of blood left me feeling physically weak, even after the adrenaline wore off. Story 30. I did this as a summer job while studying medicine because I wanted to learn how to deal with families who had lost someone. Most of the bodies we handled were elderly people who passed away at home or in the hospital due to age-related causes. Sometimes, however, we received calls from the police to recover bodies after crimes, and I was shocked by how many murders happened around me without ever reaching the media, as they were often kept quiet. The worst experience I ever had happened one night while I was on call at home. I had just finished a workday and was heading back when my boss called and told me to pick up a colleague because there was a police request. We were told it involved the bodies of a mother and her child. I picked up my colleague, and when we arrived near the address, a police car was waiting and instructed us to follow because we would not find the location on our own. We drove deeper and deeper into the woods until we reached a secluded wooden cabin. We got out of the van, and an investigator in a white protective suit told us to follow him. We walked through a gate, and he pointed to a white blanket on the ground and said that the mother was there, but that we would go to the child first. Inside the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the overwhelming mess everywhere, forcing us to carefully step through the debris. The second thing I noticed was a table covered in empty bottles and empty pill boxes. We entered the child's bedroom, where the investigator said the girl was lying on the bed. Instead of a door, there was a curtain which I pulled aside, and at first all I saw were stuffed animals, hundreds of them, on shelves, the floor, and covering the bed. Then I saw the girl lying among them. She had been shot in the head with a shotgun, leaving a catastrophic wound. Still not knowing the full story, we prepared her body and transported her to the van. After that, we returned to the mother. When I lifted the blanket, I saw a red mark around her neck beneath a scarf. At first, I thought she had been attacked with a knife, but there was no blood. Then I noticed a ladder beside me, followed it upward, and saw a rope hanging from a wooden beam. In that moment, I understood what had happened. The mother had killed her own child and then taken her own life. Story 31. When I was in my 20s, my girlfriend and I were fishing on a reservation in Montana. Accidents were common in that area, so I always drove cautiously. After we finished and started the long drive home, two vehicles sped past us at what had to be well over 100 miles per hour on a two-lane highway. One was an older Chevrolet van, and the other was a small compact car. Ahead were three sharp hairpin turns. After the second turn, we came upon a scene that looked like a battlefield of wreckage and human remains. Both vehicles had lost control and struck the embankment. The smaller car had flipped more than 10 times, crushing its roof, while the van lay upright but had rolled for over 100 yards, ejecting everyone inside. The first victim I reached was a man who had been thrown from the vehicle and landed about 10 feet from the road. The force of the impact had caused devastating injuries, though others were far worse. Another man, who appeared to have been ejected from the van, had been thrown an impossible distance. He was a very large man, well over 6 feet tall, and his body was catastrophically damaged. There were body parts scattered across the ground between him and the vehicle. Out of 9 people involved, only 1 survived. Most were already gone when we arrived, and we were the first people on the scene. I watched several individuals die there in that field. I have seen death before, so it was not the fact that they died that stayed with me, but the way it happened. Days later, we learned it was connected to a failed substance deal, with large amounts of money and substances found at the scene. Even now, every time I drive past that stretch of road, I remember the images from that night and my girlfriend crying beside me. Story 32, I was not a cleanup worker, but I was working as an electrician on a house that had recently been sold, installing additional outlets and overhead lights in the bedrooms. When we arrived, the new owners were already doing deep cleaning because the previous owners had smoked heavily inside the house for more than 40 years. In one back bedroom, they had been forced to use wall scrapers and heavy-duty chemical cleaners. We later learned that the house had been occupied by a married couple and their adult special needs daughter, who was around 50 years old. The mother became ill and passed away, and the father was also in poor health. Rather than risk his daughter becoming a burden to other family members after his death, he made the decision to shoot her, the family dog, and then himself. It reportedly took 2 shots for him to die, which explained the 2 bullet holes found in the wall and ceiling where he had been sitting against the wall. The daughter had not died immediately, and there were bloody drag marks across the wooden floor where she had tried to escape the room, likely attempting to get help before bleeding out in the doorway. Although the scene had been partially cleaned of the major biological hazards, when we were there more than a year later, there were still remnants of brain matter, bone fragments, hair, and dried blood stuck to the back of the door, the walls, the ceiling, and the floor, all of which had to be chipped or scraped away. The floor itself appeared to have been wiped, but the pooled blood had permanently stained it and likely required replacement. The house, a large Victorian 2-story with a full basement, 3-car garage, walk-up attic, and 5 bedrooms, had sold at a steep discount because of its history. My apprentice was visibly shaken when I had to leave him alone in the house for a short time while I went to another job site, and he was worried about spirits or ghosts still being present. Nothing happened, but he remained deeply unsettled. The entire situation was heartbreaking, and it was disturbing to see the physical remnants while thinking about how desperate the father must have been and how terrifying the daughter's final moments were. Story 33. 2 incidents really stood out to me. In the first, I was driving home from work and was very close to my apartment when part of the road was blocked off because of an accident. After showing proof that I lived there, they let me through, but my apartment directly faced the scene. A woman on a scooter had been struck and crushed between a truck and a car. There was no speeding involved, just a steep hill with a red light at the bottom. The impact caused catastrophic injuries, and parts of her body were trapped between the vehicles. Emergency responders covered what they could as quickly as possible, and it was clear the accident had happened not long before. I do not remember seeing the truck driver, but the car driver was still there and was clearly in shock. My roommate and I stood silently with a small group of neighbors watching the cleanup as responders pried the cars apart, collected the remains, and washed the blood from the road. Because it was the rainy season in Florida, the evidence did not remain visible for long. The second incident involved an elderly couple who were hit while driving to church. They pulled out in front of a man traveling at extremely high speed in a residential zone. Both vehicles were completely destroyed. I happened to be walking nearby before medical responders arrived and could see that both occupants of the car were deceased from the severity of the impact. The driver who hit them survived with injuries and was sitting on the roadside. That scene stayed with me because the couple died instantly while the person responsible lived and was later jailed.